Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Healing Through Community Art, how to host a Momentum Quilt workshop. Please keep in mind that the content of this webinar may be upsetting, especially for individuals who have experienced sexual violence. Please take care of yourself during this time. Joining us today on this webinar are Rebecca Nagel, Hannah Brancato, and Carla Vierteller will be presenting. This webinar is sponsored by the Sexual Violence Across the Lifespan Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. The goal of the project is to provide technical assistance and training around sexual violence for advocates, law enforcement officers, medical professionals, prosecutors, and anyone who works with victims of sexual violence so that we can provide trauma-informed resources information. The Lifespan Project offers training and technical assistance upon request. We create resources that are relevant to trauma-informed responses to victims of sexual assault. We encourage networking, collaboration, and referrals, and we also host a feel-good Tumblr site around self-care. The Lifespan Project feels that the key for working with survivors in a trauma-informed basis and making the healing process as simple as possible is to work together with allied professionals. We do a flyer, and we also host the Tumblr site, which the link is there. And now we're going to hear from Force.
So this is Rebecca Nagel from Force of Studying Rape Culture. Force is an art and activist effort to upset what we see as the dominant culture of rape and promote a counterculture of consent. We believe that sex should be pleasuring and empowering rather than coercive and violent. And what we're going to talk to you today is the work that we're doing to create a cultural shift to build a public culture that supports survivors rather than shame survivors. So we believe that rape culture are the things that surround us in our everyday environment that make rape seem inevitable and like a problem that can't be solved. And as Force, we work on a couple of elements of rape culture. One is promoting consent as an alternative to rape culture, and another is to, as you see in this infographic, promote a culture that supports rape survivors and says, you are not alone, we are listening, it's not your fault, and we believe you. So to that end, we're currently creating a crowdsourced project called the Monument Quilt, which is a collection of survivor stories written and stitched onto pieces of red fabric and blanketing public spaces to create and demand a space to heal in a highly visible and public domain. The quilt works to change the mainstream narrative around sexual violence from a very narrow narrative by creating a mainstream narrative that tells many stories instead of one. So most often in the media, when survivors are talked about publicly, they're most often white, straight women, and that leaves out a lot of other types of survivors and people. And so by creating this crowdsourced collection, we're telling a multiplicity of narratives and opening that narrative up, which is one step we see as being important in ending sexual assault and domestic violence, is that many different types of stories are recognized and heard. So the Monument Quilt is built on the idea that we need to hear and witness and tell many stories, not just one. So the Monument Quilt is touring around the country in the lead up to a final and culminating display on the National Mall, in which 6,000 stories will cover 1 mile and spell out the phrase, not alone. Last summer, as you see here, we traveled to 13 cities and towns across the U.S. and displayed the first several hundred quilt squares. Currently, in 2015, we have reached 1,000 quilt squares. So we'll continue to collect the Monument Quilt stories until we reach that 6,000 number and we're prepared for the National Mall display. So when thinking about hosting a Monument Quilt workshop, one of the outcomes of the project is the unique healing space that the Monument Quilt provides. So for a lot of survivors that have participated in the project that we've talked to, by accessing healing not just through talking, but through physically making an object, is another way to release pain and trauma that a lot of survivors didn't even realize that they needed. So it's a lot, and the other way that the Monument Quilt adds to a healing process beyond what a lot of survivors can easily access is that it creates a space for survivors to have their experience publicly recognized. So rape and abuse are often very isolating experiences that people feel like they can't talk about publicly. And even if people only just want to sit in their quilt square, they're telling their story in a way where they know that the public will be reading the story. And through creating these public displays, the Monument Quilt reconnects survivors to their community in part of that healing process.
So as Emily Shaw said, who visited the Monument Quilt display in Chicago last summer, you can't always heal your heart with your head. I've worked in social justice long enough that I don't have any cognitive problems with what happened. I know it's not my fault, and I know I'm not alone. No one has to tell me that. But even when you know that in your mind, it's hard to know and to feel that truth in your body. Working through art accesses a different part of your healing process that you can't always reach through words alone. So this is an important theme to keep in mind in thinking about hosting a quilt workshop.
Cool. One of the other goals of the Monument Quilt is to take the burden off of survivors and create a model where communities and cities and towns and ultimately U.S. start to hold that burden publicly. And so this is a quote actually from me, Rebecca Nagel. As a survivor, I am not what is broken. What is broken is our culture. As a survivor, I am not what needs to change and adapt. I am not what caused the violence. But when you look at our models for responding to violence, they're all about making the survivors feel better, more resilient. What needs to change is our culture. We need more models for healing that include healing what is fundamentally broken, our culture of rape. I can't change what happened to me, but I can change the culture that created my abuse.
So as survivors are participating in this process, they're engaging in a lifelong process of healing. We know that as a survivor, the process of healing doesn't end right after the immediate instance that has occurred, and that through activism, there's a sense of empowerment that can aid in that longer-term process of healing. So importantly, as we mentioned, the Monument Quilt contains a multiplicity of narratives and many different stories. We believe that in changing the culture of race and creating a culture of support for survivors, it's essential that survivors' own stories and voices are centered. So as Mel Keller from Baltimore said, what I love about the whole project is the narrative of control by survivors. The diversity of stories on the quilt shows how rape affects all people in different ways. When rape victims are discussed in a non-blaming manner, they're generally young, heterosexual, white women. The quilt squares are made by male victims of sexual violence, people victimized by family members, partners abused by their intimate spouses, and other people we don't often see discussed in the media to tell an uncomfortable truth. Recognizing these stories is one huge step towards ending rape. So as you begin to prepare, knowing some of these common and primary themes in the Monument Quilt for your workshop, there are a few more logistical things that you'll want to keep in mind. So again, you'll want to have, read through our website, themonumentquilt.org, and get a little bit more of a sense of some of the kind of guiding beliefs of the Monument Quilt. You can actually read our guiding beliefs in the About section on the website in more depth. And then, once you're starting to prepare, here are some of the things that you need to know ahead of time. First of all, who is going to be attending your workshop? Is your workshop going to be public or private? Will the attendees to your workshop already know each other? Have the survivors already told their stories? Or also, will the attendees of your workshop be survivors, or will they be secondary survivors or supporters? Is your workshop for a specific group such as LGBTQ, women of color, or male survivors? So in other words, will you be creating an intentional space for a particular group of survivors?
And we have, on our website, we have, and we'll get into this more, different resources and different guides on how to host a quilt making workshop. And under those resources, there is a guide that was created in collaboration from people who hosted intentional spaces both at quilt displays and at workshops. And so there's a guide on how to make an intentional space workshop or quilt display.
Okay.
So one of the important aspects of hosting a workshop is supporting survivors. So going back to those resources, we have a guide on our website called Knowing How to Support Survivors. If you go to the workshops tab, it's under resources for facilitators. So what is really important is that the workshop is a trauma-informed space. And a couple things to keep in mind is you, as a workshop facilitator, it's really good to give all the workshop attendees choices. You never want to make anyone do anything while they're at the workshop. If you think about what survivors' experiences are, you know, the experience of surviving sexual assault is someone taking that choice away from you and taking the control that you have over your body away from you. And so the process of healing and re-empowerment, it's really important that choices are a part of the workshop. And so you can set that up by having an area where people can write, an area where people can draw, maybe an area where people can just take cookies. And then in situations where people are sharing during the workshop, make those things optional. And you can give people a couple options. So if everyone is going to go around the circle and share, there can be 2 or 3 questions that people can choose to respond from. Another way that's important is to maintain boundaries. So people who've been assaulted or have been abused have had their boundaries violated. And so feeling safe and building trust in relationships with supporters are building those trusting relationships with people who maintain boundaries. A few other things that are in our guide for hosting a workshop are some basic things to say and things to avoid saying. So it's good to say things like, it's not your fault, you didn't deserve what happened to you, I'm here, I'm listening. Things that you want to avoid saying would be asking for details or asking for questions. So like, oh, well, was someone in your family? Who was that? Or how old were you? Or where did that happen? You don't want to ask prying questions, and you also don't want to ask questions where you're judging the survivor. So, well, why didn't you report that incident to the police? So it's really important that the questions that you ask are very, very, very open, and you don't push for details that people might not want to share, and that you reflect back and affirm the survivor. So, you know, if the survivor feels like they're having a hard time and they're having a lot of negative feelings, you know, saying something like, well, you know, you're having a response to a really messed up situation.
And so we have created the Knowing How to Support Survivors Guide and the Facilitators Guidebook because we strongly believe that it's important for lay people that may not necessarily be trained to be able to lead the Monument Quilt workshop. We recommend that people lead the workshops in teams of 2 or 3 people. And we, again, like to provide these resources so that folks can learn how to witness survivor stories that might not be therapists or social workers themselves. And a lot of what we outline as well in terms of creating a trauma-informed space is that survivors should be invited to share their stories on their own terms, never on the facilitator's terms or being dictated by any external forces, but, you know, when they're ready, how they're ready, and in the form that will be helpful and make sense to them. So those are the things to kind of prioritize. So in terms of getting ready for your event, the first thing that you'll want to do is find your facilitators, right? So once you've kind of thought through, is it going to be a public or private space, and is it going to be intentional? So in terms of looking for other facilitators, you want to consider folks that might have complementary skill sets to you. If you feel that you'll be good at holding the space for the group, maybe your co-facilitator will be better with one-on-one conversations. If you're more of an artistic person yourself, maybe your co-facilitator is somebody who can kind of talk more with survivors, and you'll be able to help people with the materials. So those kinds of things. You can always stay within your kind of comfort level when it comes to how you're making the quilt squares, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. There's no particular way that the quilt squares have to be made except that they should be on red fabric. So you'll find the facilitators, 2 to 3 people. You will find a space, and you'll kind of prepare amongst yourselves about, how you're going to host the space. So you also, kind of in the interest of being able to have options and kind of different activities where folks can take breaks from making their quilt square, you might consider having a coloring table, having an area for snacks, and making sure that everybody knows that they can take a break and leave the room at any time if they need to. So when you come into this space, once you've kind of decided if folks are going to be coming and going, or are they going to be staying for the entire time, you'll want to plan an activity to introduce the quilt and warm people up to telling their story. Most people aren't going to be able to just sit down and begin making their quilt square right off the bat, right? So there are a couple ways that you can do that. You can have people break up into pairs and discuss what is a survivor, or talk about what it, how people have survived if they do identify as survivors. And so, this is just, again, a way for people to get their wheels turning and begin considering, how do they want to tell their story. Some people might want to begin planning for their quilt once you've done the warm-up activity by writing their story out, and others might want to draw, and still others might want to just begin working with material. So just have, again, those options available where people can write or draw or start to pick out their fabric. All of the quilt squares are 4 feet by 4 feet. They're mostly red. They can be made by writing in Sharpie, by painting with acrylic or fabric paint, or by sewing.
And one thing good to introduce when you introduce the workshop is also just some ground rules. So reminding people that it's okay to leave. It can be good to point out the exits in the room, let people know that it's okay for them to take a break. And you can set ground rules either as a facilitator, or you could also lead the people who are in the workshop through ground rules. So for a lot of people to share their story in the space, anonymity is really important, and that what's said in the space stays in the space. So you could come to the space with a prepared list, or you could also come to the space with an activity where you would lead people through creating that list.
And one helpful prompt could be, what do you need to feel safe in this space?
So when people are making their quilt squares, it's pretty straightforward. We ask that each quilt square is 4 by 4 feet with a 2-inch border, and that's the border is just so that when we sew them together, nothing important gets lost. And that the quilts don't have to be completely red, but are 75% or 3/4 red, so that way when we put the quilts together, they make a very strong visual. So materials to use that are fine, you can sew, you can paint, you can use permanent marker, iron-on transfers, any kind of fabric. So it can be sheets. It doesn't have to be fabric that you buy at the fabric store. Spray paint is fine. Things that don't hold up over the years that the quilt will be on display are things like hot glue, stretchy fabric, see-through fabric, fabric that's very heavy, washable markers, or paper. And different things that people can put into their quilt. People can create folds or layers and pockets in their quilt if they want to. And quilts can also be very simple. So if sewing is something that's intimidating to you as a facilitator, you can facilitate a workshop where the only materials are fabric and Sharpies.
So we never recommend that, folks organize a workshop that's outside of their comfort level. Stay within your comfort level when you're choosing the materials. Another thing to consider, 4 feet might seem large to work on, so you can also have participants work on a smaller piece and then pin or sew the smaller squares onto larger fabric before you mail them in to be added to the Monument Quilt.
So when people mail their quilt squares in, we have a submission form. There is an online version of the form, and then there's also a paper version of the form. We recommend that people fill out the online version just because it leaves less room for errors, but we also take paper submissions which you would mail in with the quilt square. We ask that people make a donation. The donation is completely optional, so folks who aren't able to make the donation can, of course, still participate in the project. It costs approximately $30 to receive, document, store, and process each quilt square, and so that goes towards the operating cost of the project. And then lastly, you mail your quilt square to Force. We process the quilt here in Baltimore, and what ultimately happens is that through the submission form, you'll be contacted with a reference number, and then throughout the life of the project, you can know where your quilt is with that reference number. So we are currently working on actually creating a digital archive of the project that will be up after the final display on the National Mall. So people will be able to search through the online database and view a picture of their quilt with their reference number.
So a couple of things to note about the submission form. If you fill out a paper form, make sure that's safety pinned securely to each individual quilt square. If you fill out the form online, make sure that the reference number is written on paper and safety pinned securely onto each quilt square. Note that although we ask for contact information, that contact information is never public. That's meant for our internal database. What is searchable will be things like location or keywords. But besides that, nobody's name will ever be published publicly without their consent. So in closing, again, we didn't talk much about doing a drop-in workshop, but just to kind of review the different formats that you might choose. You might choose to do a one-time 2-hour workshop in which folks can make their quilt square. You could set up a table at an event where people are invited to write messages of support for survivors in more of a public space. We don't recommend that survivors are necessarily sharing their story because we feel that people might be a little bit less prepared to receive the kind of support that they might need. But again, you as a facilitator can kind of plan for whatever care is going to be necessary for the format. So again, you can do a one-time workshop, or you could do a workshop where folks work over a period of 8 weeks to create their quilt square, and you could have different warm-up activities each time. There are many different ways to host a workshop, and the main thing to remember is that you should be adapting this model to the community that you're working with, adapting the themes and the format and the materials in a way that makes sense to the survivors or the supporters that will be attending. And ultimately, that's what's going to make this a healing experience where folks feel both like they've had their own internal healing process, but also the ability to connect with something much larger, a national network of survivors.
So again, there are a lot of tools available online at themonumentquilt.org, which includes the resources for facilitators that we talked about today, an evaluation, which is really helpful for us if people can fill out either as a facilitator or as a participant. There are several different handouts and worksheets. So the Planning Your Quilt Square worksheets. We also have coloring worksheets and other things that you can hand out and use in the workshop and print out. All of it's free. And we even have a couple videos that demonstrate how to make a quilt square either by sewing, and we also have a video how to make a quilt square with spray paint to help give people ideas. And we have a couple examples of people introducing and bringing people into the space.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Hannah. Some information on how to connect with both the NSVRC and our presenters. There is our phone number and email, and I know Force has a change to their email address.
So we still receive emails at this email, but the best way to get in touch with us is our Gmail account, which is all one word of settingrapeculture@gmail.com.
And you can also sign up for our email list to receive updates about the Monument Quilt at themonumentquilt.org.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. There are references from today. Again, contact information, and thank you all for your time and energy. And thanks again, Rebecca and Hannah.
Thank you.
Thank you.